paper, we examine the role of various popular factors in explaining trade imbalance between the US and China. We consider various popular explanations on the imbalances. First, we consider productivity differential between the US and China. So some people like Engel and Rogers suggest that spectacular productivity growth in the US has attracted large capital inflows and has led to current account deficit. And second, we also consider another very popular explanation based on fiscal policy. US government deficit has led to current account deficit, like twin deficit. So some people like Shin and Ito suggest this type of explanation. And the third explanation is also well known. So excess consumption in the US and excess saving in China have contributed to the imbalance. For example, the Bernanke 2005 suggests this type of explanation. And finally, some people say that foreign exchange intervention, like reserve accumulation and monetary policy, have resulted in the imbalance. So in this paper, we consider all these factors, which factor is important, by using macroeconometric model. And this is the empirical model. We use a structural behavior model with the long-run restrictions. This is introduced by Blanchard and Kwan in 1989. So we have 5 variables here, and all these variables are constructed as US against China. So this is a productivity differential between the US and China. And the second variable is government consumption, the difference between the US and China. And then we also include the private consumption and also real exchange rate and trade balance. And this equation shows the structural moving average representation. And here we impose long-run restrictions. So this is a long-run restrictions. Gij1 is equal to 0 for Jij is equal to 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, and so on. So this is kind of recursive long-run zero restrictions. So I try to explain a little bit more about the identification. So this is a table for long-term coefficient. So we have 5 variables here. And then in this model, we try to identify these 5 types of shocks. And the 0 here means that each shock does not have a long-run effect on each variable. So for example, the 0 here means that government consumption shocks do not have long-run effect on labor productivity. So we also assume that private consumption shocks, we have 0, so do not affect labor productivity differential in the long run, and also government consumption in the long run. So this is a kind of recursive type of long-run zero restrictions. So here we try to identify 5 types of shocks. One is the technology shock. Again, this represents the productivity differential between US and China. And then we also have a government consumption shock. So this represents the fiscal policy. Then we have a private consumption shock. So this reflects the consumption and saving choice. And then we also have a real demand shock. And this real demand shock represents some other type of demand shocks than private consumption shocks. So for example, foreign exchange intervention, and so on. And then we also have a nominal demand shock, and this is basically usual monetary shock. And then I'll explain this identifying assumption. So the first assumption is only technology shocks affect labor productivity in the long run. So technology shocks, we don't have 0 here, so we allow technology shocks to affect labor productivity in the long run. but all the other shocks, we have 0 here. That means that these shocks, we assume that these shocks do not have a long-run effect on labor productivity. So this type of assumption is introduced by Galli, 1999, and many past studies use this type of assumption. Then I will explain the last assumption. That's about the nominal demand shocks. So we have all zeros here. So nominal demand shocks do not have any long-run effect on any of these variables. All these are real variables. So basically, this is a long-run neutrality assumption. So usually, money doesn't affect real variables in the long run. So we impose all 0 restrictions here. So this is based on long-run neutrality. So I explained these 4 zeros. I'm sorry. These 4 zeros and these 4 zeros. And the other 3 zeros are a little bit harder to justify, but I have some explanations, but I just skip it because it takes a lot of time. But anyway, I think these 2 assumptions are quite reasonable. The technology shocks, only technology shocks have a long-run effect on labor productivity and long-run neutrality money. And this is a very popular assumption, and this is very reasonable. And the only controversy is among these 3 variables. So I put these zeros, or ordering between these 3 variables, a little bit less, a little bit controversial. So later I try to experiment with all different type of orderings. Then we use quarterly data from the first quarter of 1995 to the first quarter of 2013. And for labor productivity, we divide real GDP by employment. Then we use a CPI-based real exchange rate. And then unit root test and also co-integration tests are generally consistent with our specification. And also we apply the method by Chris Eichenbaum, Bigfossen. So we use a non-parametric estimator of the 0 frequency spectral density to avoid the possible bias in the estimation of VAR model with the long-run restrictions. Then we introduce constant and full legs. And then we also allow various structural breaks in constant terms. The first structural break is from the first quarter of 1997. Some past studies like Fred and Ald in 2007 suggest that there is a structural break from 1997 for US productivity. So I just introduced a structural break here. And I also introduced structural break from the first quarter of 2002 because China joined WTO at the end of 2001. So there may be a structural break in trade relation of China. And then I also had the dummy for global financial crisis. And this is the data. And this is impulse responses. And you can see that at the left, we have name of variables. And at the top, we have name of shocks. So each column shows effects of each structural shocks. So for example, this column shows effects of technology shocks on trade balance. So actually, that's our main interest. So we can see that technology shocks basically worsens the trade balance quite significantly. And this response is also consistent with the theory. For example, any type of intertemporal model explained by Obsfeld, Rogoff, or Engel and Rogers usually predict that technology shocks worsen the trade balance, and this is what we found in the data. And also another interesting pattern is the real exchange rate response. So here we see that real exchange rate appreciate slightly, but it is not really significant. And in the long run, real exchange rate depreciate. So when we usually emphasize the role of exchange rate in explaining trade balance, we usually say that exchange rate appreciate to worsen the trade balance. But here what we found is something different. So we find a big trade balance worsening, but real exchange rate doesn't really appreciate much, and it even depreciate in the long run. So what this implies is under technology shocks, real exchange rate is not really at the center of explaining trade balance movements. So some different dynamics than real exchange rate is important to explain this big decrease in trade balance. Then government consumption shocks worsen the trade balance, and this is not surprising because increase in government consumption usually worsen the government budget deficit. Then government budget deficit, then we have a trade deficit. So this is very similar to what we usually call as a twin deficit. So this is also consistent with the usual theory. Then consumption shock increase the trade balance, nominal demand shock increase, and real demand shock has a little bit small effect on trade balance. And this is the result for variance decomposition. And I think this is quite interesting because if we see the number, then we can easily see that technology shock is the dominant sources of trade balance fluctuations. The contribution of technology shock is ranging from 65 to 78%. So basically, technology shock explains a lot. And contribution of other shocks are relatively small, mostly less than 10%, and at best less than 15%. So in general, this impulse response and variance decomposition is consistent with explanation by Engel and Rogers. So technology shocks explain a lot of trade balance movements based on variance decomposition. And we also see that impulse responses are consistent with the theory. So in general, all these patterns support explanation based on productivity differential. Then I also applied variance decomposition to real exchange rate fluctuations, but the results are quite different. Here, so I have the table here. So previously, for trade balance fluctuations, technology shocks are most important. It dominates, but for real exchange rate response, now almost all the shocks are important. So technology shock plays some role, but other shocks also play some important roles. So the results are quite different for trade balance and real exchange rate. And this may again suggest that real exchange rate is not really at the center of explaining trade balance movements. So again, I just briefly summarize that some of our results imply that real exchange rate is not really at the center of debate on global imbalances. The first reason, because sources of fluctuations are different for real exchange rate and trade balance. So if a real exchange rate is really important, then sources of fluctuations for real exchange rate and trade balance should be very similar. But what we find is totally quite different. And also we saw that in the impulse responses of technology shock, we can see that trade balance worsens, but real exchange rate doesn't really appreciate. So again, people say that real exchange rate appreciate and trade balance worsens if real exchange rate is really important in explaining trade balance movements. But what we found is something different from what most people usually explain. So I would say that this empirical result in general suggests that real exchange rate may have played a limited role, and that we should consider factors or transmission mechanism other than real exchange rate to provide full explanations on global imbalances. And this is a final result. We also applied the historical decomposition to the mid-2000s, when the trade imbalance between the US and China is really huge. And this is the historical decomposition of real exchange rate and trade balance. So this is the first line is a real exchange rate, and the second line is trade balance. And this dotted line is a forecast error. So this dotted line is a forecast error, and the solid lines are contribution of each shock. So what this means is, like, first look at this dotted line. Then we can see that there's a big decline in trade balance for the 2004 and 2007. So this say that there was an unusually big trade balance deficit of the U.S. against China during this period. And also the real exchange rate appreciated a lot during the same period. And then let's look at the contribution of each shock. Then you can easily see that the contribution of nominal shocks are now a lot. So contribution of nominal shocks are very huge, but contribution of technology shock is very small. So this result is somewhat different from variance decomposition. So in the variance decomposition result, we found that technology shock is very important, dominate everything. But in the historical decomposition for the 2004 to 2007, now we can see that usual explanation like nominal shock and other shocks are very important. So I would say that variance decomposition and historical decompositions are somewhat different. The variance decomposition basically shows the average outcome expected from large realization from the underlying distribution of shocks. But historical decomposition shows the outcome of the particular development over specific history, in our case 2004 to 2007. So in other words, on average we expect trade balance to, the technology shocks to be very important. But when we look at the specific history of 2004 and 2007, monetary shock or some other usual explanations are very important. So, in other words, various theories of global imbalances were part of the whole picture during its peak year, 2004 to 2007. But the history is not really bound to repeat itself, because this is not really we usually expect. Then we did a lot of extended experiments to check the robustness of the result, but I will skip this part. Basically, we found that results are very robust. Then in conclusion, so to summarize, this paper examined the role of various popular factors in explaining the trade imbalance between the US and China. We used a structural VAR model with long-run zero restrictions, and we considered various popular explanations: productivity differential, fiscal policy, consumption saving, real and nominal demand shocks comprising monetary policy and foreign exchange reserve accumulation. And we found that technology shocks are the most important source of trade balance fluctuations. The usual movement pattern of the trade balance and real exchange rate is not found under technology shocks. And other shocks play a very minor role. On the other hand, different from this variance decomposition, during the peak year of trade imbalance between 2004 and 2007, various influences are important. Not only technology shocks, but other shocks are all important. However, we'd like to say that the experience of the mid-2000s does not need to be repeat itself, because that's basically atypical development different from the average tendency. Thank you very much.